Hello everyone, and thanks so much for taking the time to check out this video. Today's going to be another installment to my ongoing series on the SKS Pattern Carbine, in which I will do my best to address what I consider to be the greatest of all misconceptions regarding the SKS family as a whole, specifically regarding the quality and even more importantly the status of the Chinese Type 56 carbine. I should mention that this is a subject near and dear to my heart, and it is my hope that in the future I'll have a little bit more knowledge and a little bit better presentation skill such that I might more adequately do this story some semblance of justice. For today, however, please bear with me. I am still practicing and learning. As my very last aside, a quick disclaimer for the 6 or 7 people who are actually regularly watching my videos. This is not a replacement to the 3-part relative quality series. That final video is still coming. Yeah, this is more just a clickbaity way to bring some new viewers into the fold and hopefully trick some people into getting some cool SKS knowledge that is actually worth learning. Maybe 9 to 10 people this time, we'll see. Boy, that thing is going to be heavy to hold the other way this whole video, so we're switching it up. So enough goofing around, let's hit this thing head on and answer the question. Are Chinese Type 56s garbage? Short answer, no, they're the furthest thing from it. Not only are they not a cheap imitation of their Soviet ancestors, but they were by far the most successful and battle-proven members of the SKS lineage. In fact, it's only due to the magnitude of the Type 56 carbine's accomplishments that we actually remember the platform as a whole, at least in the way that we do, which by the way is the 3rd most produced auto-loading rifle in history, the largest percentage of which are Chinese. To tell the story of the SKS carbine is to tell the story of a Chinese carbine, and perhaps more importantly, of a Chinese doctrine of war. Again, I'm concerned I will not do the story justice, but for the sake of giving it a fair shot, I'll start at the beginning. If you're anything like me, your introduction to the study or collection of SKS pattern carbines went something like this. This is the SKS. It's a Russian gun, but it was made by a few other countries. The Russian ones are the best, the Yugoslavian ones are decent, and the Chinese ones are poorly made knockoffs. And there are a few other versions that I can't remember off the top of my head. Well, if you've seen my series on relative quality, or better yet, you've owned and shot more than a couple examples of each, you probably know that this common knowledge is already riddled with inconsistencies, but it goes so much deeper than that. Yes, the SKS pattern carbine is a Soviet design through and through. Samozaryadny karabin systemy Simonova, the auto-loading carbine of Simonov. Developed by scaling down the Titanic Simonov anti-tank rifle, or PTRS-41, the SKS is nothing if not a distinctly Soviet reaction to the devastation which the Russians call the Great Patriotic War, what Americans call the Eastern Front of World War II, or what the world calls the most costly theater of war of all time. Indeed, if the SKS-45 had been ready just a few years earlier, it may have earned its place on the Ostfront, as surely it would have been among the best infantry weapons of the era. Unfortunately for the more than 8 million Soviet fighters who lost their lives in that conflict, the SKS was not ready in time and did not see adoption and mass production until post-war, at which time it had to compete with the cutting-edge Avtomat Kalashnikova. In Soviet military service, the SKS-45 was categorically outclassed by its select-fire little brother, the AK, and its use was ultimately defined by ceremonial drill teams and reservists, rather than warfighters. Much like the M44 carbine, which it was designed to replace, the SKS came simply too late to enjoy its moment of glory. Soviet SKS production lines quietly ground to a halt in 1958, and if the SKS pattern carbine was really just a Russian rifle, that's where our story would have ended, as a footnote rather than its own chapter in the history of small arms. Obviously, that's not where our story ended, however. While the SKS-45 was already obsolete by Soviet standards, the ever-charitable USSR passed down the weapon like hand-me-down clothes, delivering technical data packages, tooling, and complete rifles to those less fortunate nations which they deemed to be ideologically righteous, i.e. fellow communists. Some of these vassal states, Romania and East Germany to name a couple, seemed to produce the SKS pattern only as long as they had to, just as soon as Uncle Khrushchev was willing to share with them the secret recipe for making the Kalash. Other countries, however, China above all else, took a slightly different approach, and I argue this is where the true legacy of the SKS pattern was born. What students of the SKS are obliged to understand above all else is that China in the mid-20th century did not fight wars the way Russia did. No, the People's Republic of China, a much younger nation, was won through a very specific flavor of guerrilla warfare, developed by none other than Mao Zedong himself. Mao proselytized an asymmetrical doctrine of warfare he called the People's War, which heavily emphasized what would be best described as self-sufficient light infantry units and ideologically governed militias who were expected to operate outside of conventional battle lines and maintain combat readiness and effectiveness with or without intact supply lines, communication lines, or mechanized support elements. This philosophy radically differed from Soviet doctrine, which at this point had been defined by the large-scale mechanized engagements they had faced in their war against the Nazis. So why does this matter? Everything that made the SKS pattern obsolete by Soviet standards was turned on its head when the weapon was introduced to the Chinese doctrine of warfare. In the People's War, resupply was never a guarantee, and ammunition accountability was paramount. The lower capacity and semi-automatic nature of the SKS pattern fit that bill perfectly. What the Soviets, who operated under the assumption of intact supply lines, saw as a liability, the Chinese recognized as a natural regulating effect, which encouraged efficient shot placement without totally precluding the possibility of achieving fire superiority with a larger sized element. Additionally, the Chinese recognized that the SKS pattern's extremely lightweight stripper clip feeding devices allowed for combat effective reloads without the weight of self-contained magazines. Remember, at this time, AK magazines were of the steel variety, which weigh 1/3 of a kilogram each, empty. For ultra-mobile guerrilla fighters literally living off the land, cutting kilograms of equipment saves countless desperately needed calories in the long run and drastically simplifies the warfighting process. As a quick aside, if anybody at home is having trouble imagining what this theory looks like in practice, you need look no further than the Viet Cong forces faced by the American and Anzac forces in Vietnam who followed Mao's doctrine to the letter. By no coincidence, many VC were issued exclusively Chinese Type 56 carbines, with the section leader alone carrying a Kalashnikov. Was this a great strategy? Possibly, possibly not. Ultimately, that's not for me to say. I think we can all agree, however, that as long as enough young men are willing to show up and die for communism, it worked well enough to achieve their strategic objectives, or at the very least, prevent a technically superior adversary force from achieving theirs. For better or for worse, China remained more or less committed to the People's War doctrine and its warhorse, the Type 56 carbine, until their own brush with Vietnamese forces in 1979. Whether by coincidence or not, this was precisely the same time that legendary Jiangxi factory in Chongqing, China finally ceased production. It would behoove viewers to be aware that this enigmatic factory, also called State Arsenal 21, also called State Arsenal 296, and as many in the United States call it, the Triangle 26 factory, produced almost exactly 4 million Type 56 carbines over a 25-year period, meaning that it produced more SKS pattern carbines than any other factory in the world. That doesn't even begin to account for Type 56 carbine production at other Chinese factories, which began in the early 1970s and continued into the 1990s, yielding a total national production which roughly matches, if not actually exceeds, the rest of the world's SKS pattern carbine production numbers combined. I should also add, while we are talking about production, that much has been made in the US collector community about the Chinese decision to introduce stamped parts. It's perfectly valid for collectors to prioritize certain manufacturing styles over others. But the moment this crosses the line into implication that the presence of stamped components makes Chinese examples somehow functionally inferior is outlandish. I look forward to having it explained to me how stamped parts are a liability. Perhaps we can use this RPK as a demonstration piece. No? How about this G3 instead? It's got a lot of stamped parts. The fact is that stamped parts, while aesthetically lacking compared to old world milling, do not inherently reduce strength or functionality, and like it or not, stamping's a reality of modern manufacture. If the Soviets had found a reason to stick with the SKS, they would have done the same thing and called it the SKS-M, with the M standing for Modernizirovanich. Can't fucking say that without cracking up. I really struggle with that particular word. The Chinese took a deflated Soviet design and they breathed life into it. While the Soviets relegated the SKS-45 to the sidelines of combat, the Chinese doctrine of warfare allowed the SKS pattern to finally have its moment of glory, serving irregular guerrilla forces on asymmetrical battlegrounds. Even countries like Yugoslavia continued to produce their own indigenous variant of the SKS Pattern Carbine long after they had developed their own M70 Kalashnikov variant, because they learned from the Chinese exactly how deadly the SKS pattern could be when you put it in the right hands. And indeed, it was Yugoslavian M5966A1s, not unlike the one I just showed you, being carried as far off as South Africa. By whom, you ask? But none other than the People's Liberation Army of Namibia. What a strange coincidence. In summary, the Soviets may have designed the SKS pattern, but the Chinese showed the world how to use it. So next time someone tries to tell you that a Type 56 carbine is just a cheap knockoff of the SKS, push back a little. Suggest that maybe the Chinese didn't just clone the Soviet design, but they fully embraced it, invested in it, and made it better. If someone tries to tell you that Soviet SKS-45s are so much better, let them check out an early Triangle 26. I've owned quite a few, and the only difference I can find between these rifles is that the safety on one works. Oh yeah, one more thing. The Chinese cuts the group size on that Izhevsk in half. If someone tries to tell you that Chinese Type 56 carbines are always beat up, you can say, yeah, that's what happens when a rifle gets used a lot. Oh, and the other thing about rifles that get used a lot, it's a distinction of rifles that work, and work well. A little character never hurt anybody. If someone tries to tell you that Chinese Type 56 carbines got less cool when they started stamping trigger guards, well, you can show them a documented Israeli-captured Palestinian Liberation Organization Type 56 carbine brought back from the 1982 invasion of Lebanon. I don't know about you, but I'm a curio and relic guy, and this makes me pretty excited. Oh, and if someone tries to tell you that the early ones are decent, but quality went downhill fast, show them one of these 1980 or 1979 final Triangle 26 production run rifles. This was supposed to be in the background. My bad, I forgot it this whole time. Good problem to have, too many Type 56 carbines to keep track of. Yeah, a little melted profile barrel lug, little reversed tab on the takedown lever with a corresponding stock cut. Forgive me for enjoying the craftsmanship of the most experienced SKS pattern carbine producer in human history. My bad. Heck, show them a 1988 commercial export, literally built from scrapped, possibly rejected military parts, that runs like a top because it came from the place that knows more about making these than anybody else. All right, that's my video. I hope some folks out there enjoyed it, learned something, or at least were pleasantly, if briefly, distracted from the tedium of their day. If you did like this video, I would greatly appreciate you hitting the like button. That lets me know that it wasn't a total waste of my time. If you did not enjoy the video, I would say go ahead and hit the dislike button, but it's 2022 and the YouTube dislike button is kind of like the close the door button in an elevator. It's there to make you feel powerful, but it's not connected to anything. So luckily there's still an alternative. If you disagree with me, and rather than offer corrections, contrary evidence, or otherwise engage me in human debate, you would prefer to insult the essence of my being, YouTube has a comment feature specifically designed to facilitate, and you can find that right below this video. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining me, and I hope to catch you again in another video.